Hello friends. Have you ever wondered, is your Kiwisaver provider any good? Or are they simply just taking your hard-earned money every week with nothing to show for it? Now personally, I have often thought about this question, and this is why I went to Morningstar. Now Morningstar is a financial website that produces Kiwisaver surveys every 3 months that ranks the individual Kiwisaver provider and their funds in terms of returns. And the results may be shocking to you. We're going to find out which Kiwisaver is doing well, which one are essentially just stealing money from you. The Kiwisaver funds are separated into 5 main big types of funds. Now these include the conservative, moderate, balanced, growth, and aggressive funds. And the main difference is that each of them invests in a different proportion of growth assets. So the more aggressive funds tend to invest more in the growth assets, whereas the most conservative fund invests more in cash assets so that your investment is more secured in the short term. In terms of the returns itself, the survey looked at the total returns over a 3-month period, 1-year period, 3-year period, 5-year period, and over a 10-year period. Now, some of the funds are still quite new, so they don't actually have results for the 10-year return. So in this comparison, I'm going to be focusing more on the 5-year return for these particular funds, and I'm going to pick out the top 3 ranked funds in each of the different fund categories. First up, we have the conservative Kiwisaver funds. Now, the conservative funds have an average growth asset of around 20%, which means 20% of these funds are invested in the growth assets, with 80% in other assets, which includes more conservative assets such as cash and term deposits. Now, in terms of rankings, at number 3, we have a Key Street Conservative Fund with a 5-year average return of 3%. At number 2, for the conservative fund, we have the Kiwi Wealth Default Conservative Fund with an annual return of 3.1% for the conservative funds over the past 5 years. Now, compared to the Key Street funds, it has a management fee of 0.52%, which is less than the Key Street Conservative Fund of 0.76%. So even when looking at these results, you have to just keep in mind that different Kiwisaver providers charge different management fees, and that could affect the eventual final result over time. At number 1, for the conservative Kiwisaver fund, we have a Milford Conservative Fund at 3.2% return per annum over the past 5 years, with a management fee of 0.95%. Now, the differences between these top three conservative funds isn't really all that great. The next category that we're going to look at are the moderate Kiwisaver funds. So these funds have an average growth asset investment ratio of around 30 to 40%, but usually a lot of it falls around the 35% range. So at number 3, we have BNZ Moderate Fund with an annual return of 3.2% and a management fee of 0.45%. At number 2, we have MAS Moderate Kiwisaver Fund with an annual return over the past 5 years of 3.3%. So this is a little bit higher than the BNZ return for the BNZ fund. They have a management fee of 1.02%. At number 1, for the moderate Kiwisaver fund, we have the Generate Moderate Fund with a 5-year average return of 4.1%. They have a higher management fee of 1.14%. Now, one interesting thing to note is that the growth asset ratio for all these 3 funds are some of the highest when compared to all of the other conservative Kiwisaver funds. So all of these 3 funds invest to around 40% in growth assets. So a lot of time you would think that more growth assets basically means a higher return, whereas in this particular situation it does actually apply. Now we're going to take a look at the balanced Kiwisaver fund. So the balanced Kiwisaver fund has the largest number of Kiwisaver providers in this particular category. So there's quite a lot of Kiwisaver providers that provide a balanced Kiwisaver fund. So for a balanced Kiwisaver fund, you're looking at around 55 to around 60% in terms of the growth assets investment. So they invest a little bit more than half of the investment in growth assets. So onto the ranking itself now. At number 3 is Key Street Balance Kiwisaver Fund with an annual return at 5.9% over the past 5 years, and they have a management fee of 1.02%. Again, Key Street shows up again. They're one of the smaller Kiwisaver funds, but they did appear again in this top 3 ranking. At number 2, we have Superlife Ethica with around 6% annual return over the 5-year period. And number 1 for the balanced fund category, we have Milford Balanced Fund with a 6.8% annual return over the past 5 years and a management fee of around 1.06%. Now, one of the most interesting things that I found for the Milford Balanced Fund is that they only have 42% of the particular fund actually invested in growth assets, compared to the other 2 funds that are in the top 3 for this category. They have around 60% invested in growth assets, and normally you would think that more growth assets means more growth and more returns. Milford proves that to be not the case, with less invested in growth assets, yet ultimately getting a higher return over a long period of time. Now we're on to the major category of the Kiwisaver Growth Funds. So growth funds are actually the biggest pool of Kiwisaver funds. They have more than 32 billion New Zealand dollars invested in those growth funds. So at number 3, we have Simplicity Growth Fund with a very low management fee of 0.29%. And they have around 80% invested in growth assets. At number 2, we have Key Street Growth Funds with an annual return of 7%. With a management fee of 1.29%. So even though the returns are similar to the Simplicity Growth Funds, they do have a significantly higher management fee. At first place for the Kiwisaver Growth Fund, we have a Milford Active Growth Fund with an annual return of 8.5% and a management fee of 1.2%. Now, Milford Active Growth Fund is one of the largest fund providers with more than 4 billion New Zealand dollars under management. Again, one of the interesting things with all these Milford funds is that the Milford Active Growth Fund actually only has around 60% in terms of growth assets, compared to the other 2, which has around 70 to 80% in growth assets. So again, Milford's is achieving the same thing while having more returns while having less in terms of growth assets. Now onto the last category, which are the aggressive Kiwisaver funds. Now the aggressive funds have around 90% of the funds allocated in growth assets. So in theory, they should achieve higher returns over the longer term period. But for a lot of these funds are, again, relatively newish. So the 10-year returns are still yet to be seen. But let's look at the current returns for some of the funds here. So at number 3, for the aggressive funds, we have Kiwisaver Wealth Growth. So the Kiwisaver Growth Wealth Scheme with a 5-year return of 7.1%. They have a management fee of 1.13%, which is actually, again, reasonably high when it comes to a Kiwisaver provider. At number 2, we have the Booster High Growth Fund with a 5-year average return of 7.1% and a management fee of 1.27%. Now, it's become a bit of a theme here that a lot of these aggressive funds tend to have a higher management fee because they say that they provide better return over the long term, which again is kind of debatable. At number 1, for the highest return over the 5-year period for the aggressive Kiwisaver fund, we have Booster Social Responsible High Growth Fund with an average annual return of 8.5% over the 5 years, management fee 1.17%. Interesting to note here is that Kiwi Wealth Scheme Growth Fund has only around 80% that's actually invested in growth assets. So, I would barely call it an aggressive fund. Whereas the other two have more than 90% of their investment invested in growth assets. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that I have observed. So the first thing is that Key Street Investing has a couple of Kiwisaver funds that show up in the top 3 ranked funds. Now, Key Street Investing is one of the probably smaller Kiwisaver providers, so I am not particularly familiar with them, but again, if you're interested in returns, they may be worth checking into. I'm not sponsored by any Kiwisaver provider for this video, so don't ask me which one is good and which one is not. Again, I just provide the results and you could just have a look yourself. Secondly, for the aggressive Kiwisaver funds, Booster Kiwisaver owns 2 out of the 3 top aggressive funds for Kiwisaver, which again is quite interesting. One of the other thing is that for the default Kiwisaver providers that you get automatically assigned to when you first start working, none of them have appeared in the highest ranked returns for the Kiwisaver. So if it's returns that you are looking for, it may be worth switching from your default provider that you get automatically assigned to another Kiwisaver provider. And you really want to pay attention to the fees, because fees may end up being the main difference between the different returns that you get for the Kiwisaver providers. Now, how hard is it to actually switch these Kiwisaver providers? The simple answer is it is extremely easy. Now, Kiwisaver providers are pretty desperate to take your money. So pretty much all you need to do is to just sign up to them and they will simply do the rest. And it's up to you to compare the different funds